The silence she cultivated was a shield, thick as any armor, and Captain Evan Rexford's disdain was merely the dull thud of a spent round against it. He looked past her, through her, a woman whose age was hard to place, etched not by years alone but by something deeper, something weathered, her movements economical in the faded utility uniform. Her hands, surprisingly strong and deft-looking, were clasped loosely behind her back, her gaze fixed on some point beyond the humming concertina wire of forward-operating base Kestrel. "Specialist Davies," Rexford said, his voice clipped, impatient, the title a deliberate diminishment in this high-octane environment of lean young soldiers barely out of their teens. He prided himself on his unit's edge, its modernity. Davies looked like a relic. "Logistics says you're our new general maintenance tech for the auxiliary systems." "Auxiliary. Try not to get in the way. We run a tight ship here, Specialist. Very tight." He did not wait for a reply, nor did he expect one beyond meek compliance. He turned back to his cluster of eager lieutenants, their faces mirroring his casual dismissal, their youth a bright, hard currency he valued. Alara Davies, whose true name had been a whisper in the high desert winds of forgotten conflicts, simply inclined her head once to his retreating back. The dust, stirred by the departing patrol vehicles, settled around her, a familiar, almost comforting cloak. She had been invisible for so long, this was just another shade of unseen. Her assigned domain was a hulking, temperamental diesel generator, nicknamed Old Bess by the grunts. It powered the non-essential parts of the FOB, the dim lights in the laundry tent, the sputtering air conditioner in the makeshift MWR, the coffee machine in the command tent that Rexford insisted was vital for morale, meaning his. Previous technicians had treated Bess with a mixture of fear and contempt. She was prone to fits and starts, her coughing roars often dying into ominous silence at the worst possible moments. Ilara approached the machine not as a problem to be conquered, but as a complex being to be understood. Her first days were spent in quiet observation, listening to its rhythms, her hands tracing its aging pipes and conduits, her ear pressed to its metal skin. She found loose connections others had missed, a hairline crack in a fuel line sealed with crude epoxy, a governor that stuck not from malice, but from grit accumulated over years of neglect. She didn't speak much to the soldiers who occasionally wandered past, their curiosity about the new, quiet woman quickly giving way to indifference. They saw her wiping grease from her hands, her brow furrowed in concentration, and filed her away as just another cog, slightly older, definitely odder. Private First Class Miller, a lanky kid with perpetually worried eyes and a nervous habit of adjusting his helmet, was one of the few who watched her with more than passing disinterest. His own task was to refuel Bess, a job he dreaded because it often coincided with one of its tantrums. One sweltering afternoon, as Miller fumbled with a heavy fuel can, Bess sputtered, coughed violently, and died. The lights in the nearby comms tent flickered out. A chorus of groans echoed across the compound. Captain Rexford's voice, sharp with irritation, barked from the command tent. Miller braced for the usual reprimand. Alara, who had been meticulously cleaning a set of spark plugs, didn't even look up. She simply wiped her hands on a rag, picked up a wrench, and approached the generator. Miller watched, fascinated, as she moved with an unhurried grace, her actions precise. She tapped a valve here, tightened a nut there, her touch seemingly intuitive. Within minutes, after a gentle coaxing rather than a forceful cranking of the ignition, Bess rumbled back to life, smoother than Miller had ever heard her run. The lights flickered on. The distant cheer from the MWR tent was a testament to her quiet victory. Alara merely nodded once to the generator, then returned to her spark plugs. Miller, emboldened, managed a hesitant, "Thanks, Specialist." That was quick. Ilara met his gaze, and for a fleeting second, he thought he saw something other than quiet patience in her eyes. A flicker of ancient knowledge, perhaps. "She just needed a careful hand, Private," Ilara said, her voice low and even. "Like most things." The FOB was a microcosm of institutional memory, or rather, the lack of it. Rexford and his young officers were all post-9, 11 recruits, their experience forged in the asymmetric warfare of recent years, their knowledge gleaned from updated manuals and simulations. They were competent in their own sphere, but their world was narrowly defined. Colonel Thorne, the garrison commander who visited Kestrel periodically, was cut from the same cloth, albeit with more stars on his collar. He saw Davies once, her hands covered in grease, her uniform stained. He'd made a comment to Rexford about scraping the bottom of the barrel for remps these days, a remark Rexford had found amusing and affirming. Alara had heard it, of course. Such words were air. They did not touch the core of her. That core was forged in fires they couldn't imagine, in places that didn't exist on their sanitized maps. Sometimes, when cleaning a particularly stubborn piece of grime from Bess's casing, her sleeve would ride up, revealing the faintest trace of a symbol on her inner forearm, a whisper of dark ink. So faded it was almost invisible. It looked like a bird's feather, stylized, almost abstract. No one ever noticed, or if they did, they made nothing of it. Tension in the region had been escalating. Patrols returned with grim faces, tales of more sophisticated IEDs, of insurgents who seemed to anticipate their movements. Rexford, eager to prove his unit's mettle, pushed his men harder. Briefings became more intense, the atmosphere in the command tent thick with stress and stale coffee. During one such briefing, discussing a planned reconnaissance mission into a valley notorious for ambushes, Lieutenant Ames, young and keen, outlined a route based on recent drone imagery. Alara, present to report on Bess's flawless performance and the surprisingly low fuel consumption, a direct result of her meticulous tuning, stood silently near the back. As Ames pointed to a narrow pass, Alara's gaze sharpened almost imperceptibly. She knew that pass, or one terrifyingly like it, from a different lifetime. A place where the rocks themselves seemed to bleed betrayal. When Ames finished, and Rexford asked for comments, the usual chorus of agreement followed. Alara cleared her throat, a small, hesitant sound. All eyes turned to her, surprised. "Captain," she said, her voice steady. "That western approach to the pass, the imagery doesn't show the cave systems. They run deep. And the acoustics there. A small force can sound much larger. It's an old trap." A stunned silence filled the tent. Lieutenant Ames flushed, looking to Rexford for support. Rexford's eyes narrowed. "Specialist Davies," he said, his tone laced with condescension. "Are you now a tactical expert as well as a generator whisperer? We rely on up-to-date intelligence, not intuition." Alara simply met his gaze. "Terrain doesn't change as much as tactics, sir. Some places have long memories." Rexford waved a dismissive hand. "Thank you for your input, Specialist." "We'll stick to the plan." Alara nodded, said nothing more, and left the tent. The mission went ahead. 2 days later, the patrol returned, not unscathed. They hadn't been decimated, but they'd walked into a well-coordinated ambush precisely in the western approach. They'd reported disoriented echoes, attackers seeming to come from multiple directions within the rocks. Casualties were minor, thankfully, but the mission was a failure. Rexford, in the after-action report, blamed faulty drone intelligence. He never mentioned Alara's warning. But PFC Miller, who had overheard the exchange, looked at Alara with a new kind of respect, bordering on awe. And Master Sergeant Thompson, a career soldier with lines etched on his face that spoke of his own long memories, watched Alara more closely from then on, a thoughtful expression in his eyes. He'd seen a few quiet ones like her over the years, the ones who didn't talk much but knew far more than they let on. The pressure mounted not just from outside the wire, but from within. A critical communications array, the long-range uplink that connected Kestrel to Central Command, began experiencing intermittent failures. Technicians were flown in, swapped components, ran diagnostics, and left shaking their heads, blaming atmospheric conditions or sophisticated enemy jamming. Rexford grew increasingly agitated. Without reliable long-range comms, Kestrel was isolated, vulnerable. The younger officers offered frantic, textbook solutions that yielded nothing. The official channels of support were bogged down in bureaucracy, promising a specialist team that was days, possibly weeks, away. The failures became more frequent, the silences longer. During one particularly long outage, a palpable sense of unease settled over the FOB. Even the usually boisterous soldiers spoke in hushed tones. Alara, having ensured Bess was purring like a contented cat, observed the frantic activity around the comms array shelter. She saw the sweat on the technicians' faces, the frustration in their movements. She recognized the pattern of failure. It was not sophisticated jamming, nor was it a simple component burnout. It was something more insidious, something that required a deeper understanding of the system's architecture, an architecture she knew with a familiarity that would have astonished them. One evening, as dusk bled purple and orange across the harsh landscape, the array went down completely. A priority message was incoming, a warning of a large-scale insurgent movement detected by regional assets. Its probable target unclear, but Kestrel was a likely candidate. Panic, thinly veiled, began to ripple through the command structure. Rexford was on the radio to the line-of-sight backup, his voice tight, trying to get the critical data relayed piecemeal. It was slow, inefficient, and prone to error. Colonel Thorne was on a secure satellite phone, his voice a low growl of frustration as he demanded answers and solutions that weren't forthcoming. Elara watched for a moment longer. She saw young Miller looking utterly terrified, fiddling with a comms headset that was stubbornly silent. She saw Rexford slam his fist on the console. This was no longer about being unseen, about quiet competence. This was about lives. She walked purposefully towards the comm shelter. The two exhausted comms technicians, both sergeants, with impressive credentials but overwhelmed by this particular beast, looked up as she entered. "Ma'am, unless you've got a miracle in your pocket, one began, then trailed off as he saw the look in her eyes. It wasn't the look of a curious bystander. Rexford, drawn by the cessation of their frustrated banging, appeared in the doorway. "Davies! What in God's name are you doing in here? This is a restricted area, and we are in a crisis." His voice was frayed, bordering on yelling. Elara ignored the technicians. She faced Rexford directly, her calm a stark contrast to his agitation. "Captain," she said, her voice low but carrying an undeniable weight of authority, "your team is looking for a hardware fault. The primary issue is a cascade failure in the legacy decryption firmware, triggered by an overwritten handshake protocol from the last satellite software patch. It needs a manual reboot of the baseband processor and a reconfiguration of the crypto key exchange parameters. Standard diagnostics won't find it." Rexford stared at her, dumbfounded. "And how would you know that, specialist?" he demanded, sarcasm dripping from his words. "Did old Bess tell you?" One of the technicians snorted, then quickly stifled it. Elara's expression didn't change. "I know these systems, Captain. I helped design the original architecture for the SC SATCOM Block 3, which this Block 5 is based on. The vulnerabilities are similar if you don't maintain strict update protocols." A heavy silence descended. The technicians exchanged wide-eyed glances. Rexford's face was a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, uncomfortable suspicion. "You helped design it?" he stammered. "Who are you, Davies?" Elara held his gaze. There was no time for lengthy explanations, no room for his pride or her preference for anonymity. To initiate a system override and manual reconfiguration of the crypto, we need to access the fail-safe control node. It requires Tier 1 authorization. The verbal authentication for emergency access to what you call the fail-safe control node, we called it the Cerberus Protocol, is Operation Nightfall. My authorization call sign is Valkyrie. Valkyrie Actual. The name hung in the air, heavy, resonant. "Valkyrie," Rexford whispered, the color draining from his face. He was young, but not so young he hadn't heard the whispers, the almost mythical stories of certain operators and operations from the shadowed corners of recent military history. Operation Nightfall. He looked at the senior comms tech, Sergeant Pruitt, a man in his late 30s. Pruitt's jaw was slack. "Sir," Pruitt said, his voice hoarse. "Operation Nightfall. That was Delta, Kandahar. 15, maybe 20 years ago. Legendary. Classified above top secret." Elara simply stated, "The access codes are time-sensitive, Captain. We are losing that window. Will you authorize, or do I need to contact General McCreary directly? He will remember the call sign." The mention of a 4-star general, a name Rexford knew well and respected with something approaching fear, was the final blow to his crumbling disbelief. He swallowed hard. The entire dynamic in the small shelter had shifted. The quiet, overlooked maintenance tech was gone. In her place stood someone else entirely, someone who radiated an aura of absolute, unshakable competence. "Do it," Rexford said, his voice barely a croak. "Do what you have to do." Elara moved to the main console, her actions fluid, economical. The technicians, moments before the experts, now stood aside, watching with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, not with the hesitant pecking of an amateur, but with the innate familiarity of a master craftsman. She bypassed layers of security protocols that had stumped the others, her inputs precise and unerring. She murmured commands under her breath, strings of alphanumeric code, references to subsystems and diagnostic routines that were clearly not in any standard manual. Isolating primary bus, forcing cold boot of the baseband processor, reinitializing crypto handshake. Now. She paused, her eyes fixed on a cascade of data scrolling across a diagnostic screen. The air crackled with tension. Rexford held his breath. Young Miller had crept to the doorway, his eyes wide. Even Colonel Thorne, alerted by the sudden change in atmosphere, had appeared and was watching silently from just outside. "Bringing the uplink online," Ilara announced, her voice still calm, though a fine sheen of perspiration had appeared on her brow. "Stand by for satellite handshake." The indicator lights on the console, which had been stubbornly red or amber, began to blink green, one by one. A low hum filled the shelter as the main dish outside whirred, aligning itself. Then, a clear, strong carrier tone emanated from the speakers, followed by the crisp voice of a distant operator. "Kestrel Command, this is Skywatch. We read you 5 by 5. We have priority traffic for you. Acknowledge." Rexford stared at Ilara, then at the console, then back at Ilara. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost pilot, a starship. Sergeant Pruitt let out a long, shaky breath. I don't believe it," he muttered. Ilara ignored them, already speaking into the microphone, her voice professional, devoid of any triumph. "Skywatch, this is Kestrel Actual. Valkyrie on the net. Send your traffic." The name Valkyrie clearly registered with the Skywatch operator. There was a fractional pause, a subtle shift in the background noise from the other end, as if someone had suddenly sat bolt upright. "Valkyrie Actual? Stand by 1. Another brief pause, then a different voice, deeper, older, with an unmistakable edge of authority. "Valkyrie, this is Watchtower. It's been a long time. Confirm authenticity." Ilara's eyes flickered for a moment, a spark of something unreadable within their depths. "Watchtower, authenticate, silent Talon down." There was a sharp intake of breath from the other end. "Authenticated, Valkyrie? Damn glad to hear your voice. Thought you were a ghost story. What do you need?" The exchange was brief, coded, laden with unspoken history. The ease with which she commanded this channel, the instant recognition, stripped away any lingering doubt. Ilara Davies was not just who she said she was someone far more significant. The priority intelligence flowed in, detailing the imminent threat. It was worse than feared. A coordinated attack on several smaller outposts was designed to draw Kestrel's QRF out, leaving the main base vulnerable to a larger secondary assault force. Armed with this information, Rexford, though still reeling, snapped back into commander mode, his training kicking in. But now, he kept glancing at Ilara, a new, profound respect dawning in his eyes. She didn't offer further tactical advice unless asked, but when Rexford, almost hesitantly, posed a question about potential staging areas for the secondary force, based on her earlier comment about terrain having long memories, her answer was swift, precise, and chillingly plausible. She pointed to a series of seemingly innocuous depressions on the map, invisible on drone imagery but perfect for concealing a large number of fighters. "They'll use the wadis, the old smugglers' routes." "They always do." Over the next few hours, FOB Kestrel transformed into a hive of purposeful activity. Defenses were bolstered, patrols rerouted, and a counter-ambush prepared, based not just on the new intelligence, but on Ilara's quiet, firm suggestions. She moved through the preparations like a phantom, checking a weapon system here, offering a quiet word of advice to a nervous young soldier there, ensuring Bess was ready to provide uninterrupted power for the command center and medical bay. She was no longer just Specialist Davies, the grease-stained mechanic. She was a presence, a steadying force. The younger officers, who had once snickered at her age or her silence, now watched her with open admiration, some even approaching her with tentative questions, which she answered patiently, directly. Colonel Thorne observed all of this, his earlier arrogance replaced by a thoughtful, almost solemn expression. He had seen legends in his time, but he'd never expected to find one quietly tending a generator on a forgotten stretch of dirt. The attack, when it came, was fierce, but Kestrel was ready. The insurgents' feint was met with stiff resistance, and the secondary assault force walked directly into the meticulously prepared kill zone Alara had helped identify. The battle was short, brutal, and decisive. By dawn, the threat was neutralized. The cost to Kestrel was minimal, a few minor injuries. It could have been a massacre. As the sun rose, casting long shadows across the battered perimeter, an exhausted quiet settled over the base. Medics tended the wounded. Engineers repaired fortifications, and the living counted themselves fortunate. Alara was by Old Bess, wiping down the engine, her movements as methodical and unhurried as ever. The scent of diesel and cordite hung in the air. Captain Rexford approached her, his face smudged with grime, his uniform torn. He looked older than he had a day before, the youthful arrogance completely gone, replaced by a weary humility. He stood for a moment, watching her. "Specialist Davies," he began, then stopped. The title felt absurd now. "Ilara," he said, the name feeling foreign but right on his tongue. We owe you everything." Ilara paused in her work, her gaze meeting his. There was no accusation in her eyes. "No, I told you so." Just a quiet weariness. "You reacted well to the intelligence, Captain. Your men fought bravely." Rexford shook his head. "None of that would have mattered if you hadn't, if you weren't here. That call sign, Valkyrie, and Operation Nightfall. Those are shadows, legends. Why are you here, like this?" Alara picked up a rag, slowly wiping grease from her hands. On her inner forearm, the faint, stylized raven feather tattoo was briefly visible, stark against her skin in the morning light. "Someone has to keep the lights on, Captain," she said softly. "And sometimes the old ways, the old knowledge, it's still needed. The world forgets, but the rocks remember. The machines remember." She looked towards the horizon, where the sun was now a blinding disk. "My war is over. Or it was. But some skills don't fade, even when you want them to." Rexford nodded slowly, a profound understanding settling in. He knew he was in the presence of someone who had walked through hells he could only read about in classified archives, someone who had carried burdens he couldn't comprehend, and then had chosen a quiet anonymity. "The official report will credit timely intelligence and decisive leadership," Rexford said. "No mention of Valkyrie. Unless you want it." Ilara gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "No. Valkyrie retired a long time ago. Alara Davies fixes generators." She offered a rare, fleeting smile. "And this old girl," she patted Bess's casing, "is due for an oil change." Colonel Thorne arrived a little later. He didn't speak directly to Ilara, but he stood by the command tent, watching her for a long time as she worked. His usual brusque demeanor was subdued. Before he departed the FOB, he sought out Rexford. "That Specialist Davies," Thorne said, his voice unusually quiet. "Keep an eye on her, and listen to her. Some soldiers carry more than their rank suggests. Far more." Rexford simply nodded. "Yes, sir. I understand that now." PFC Miller, no longer looking terrified but filled with a quiet hero worship, brought Alara a canteen of fresh water. "Specialist Davies, ma'am," he stammered, "thank you for everything." Alara took the canteen, her fingers brushing his. "Just doing my job, Miller. Keep your head down and learn. That's all any of us can do." He nodded, his young face earnest, and retreated. Ilara took a slow sip of water, the coolness a balm in the growing heat. She looked at her hands, the ingrained grease a familiar comfort. The dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight piercing the generator shed. The sounds of the recovering base, distant hammering, voices, the rumble of a departing vehicle, were a backdrop to the steady, reassuring thrum of Old Bess, her faithful mechanical heart. Ilara Davies, Valkyrie, continued her work, a silent guardian in a world that had almost forgotten her kind, a ghost in the machine, ensuring the light stayed on, one careful bolt, one steady hand at a time. The captain, and a few others, would never look at her, or the quiet corners of their world, quite the same way again. They stood in the quiet respect that true, unassuming strength always commands.